The city burned through the night, flames licking every corner of the central square, smoke choking the streets. Amid the chaos, German POW doctors, prisoners themselves, were forced to work in the open, performing surgeries under shattered buildings and smoldering debris. Lives hung in a delicate balance, and yet no one would speak of what truly occurred. Records would later omit the events of that night entirely, leaving a haunting question: how many survived and how many vanished without a trace? Something irreversible had happened here, something that would linger in silence long after dawn. It was the bitter winter of 1945, in a city reduced to ruins by relentless bombings. Once vibrant streets lay in silent ruin, littered with debris, abandoned carts, and the remnants of shattered lives. German POWs, captured months earlier, were brought here, not as prisoners under guard, but as the only people with medical knowledge to treat the wounded. The Allied command made a decision that defied logic. Let the POWs work among civilians and soldiers alike, unarmed, without ranks, without supervision. It was a strange, uneasy truce, a plan that hinted at something larger, something no one fully understood. Even as the city's cold winds cut through the ruins, a subtle unease whispered through the streets. This night would be remembered for reasons no one would admit. By the early hours, the first disturbing signs emerged. A child, smoke-stained and shivering, was laid under the shadow of a collapsed archway, and a POW doctor worked to save him while explosions echoed in the distance. Some patients, however, disappeared quietly, leaving only empty stretchers in their place. The doctors exchanged glances, silent acknowledgement that something was wrong. Blood-soaked snow reflected the flickering lamplight, and every shadow seemed to move of its own accord. Even in this chaos, there was a pattern forming, a pattern that would suggest the night held secrets far beyond mere survival. The early revelation was small but undeniable. All was not as it seemed, and every eye in the ruins noticed it. The night dragged on, heavy with smoke and silence. POW doctors moved carefully among the wounded, each step measured, each glance cautious. Arrival meant unspoken acknowledgement. This street was now a theater of survival where no questions were safe. Civilians avoided eye contact, guards passed silently, and whispers were swallowed by the wind. Unspoken rules governed every interaction: do not interfere, do not ask, do not look too closely. Shadows shifted unnaturally as the night deepened, and the faint metallic scent of blood mixed with smoke created an almost tangible tension. Every movement, every muffled groan of the wounded, pressed upon the nerves, leaving an uncomfortable weight that seemed to stretch across the blackened ruins. Even breathing felt like a betrayal of the silence surrounding them. The night that had followed a predictable rhythm suddenly fractured. One of the POW doctors, a tall man with hands steady from years of field operations, never appeared at his usual station beside the collapsed archway. His absence was subtle at first, just a missing shadow amid the chaos, but its effect rippled immediately. Other doctors glanced at each other with fleeting suspicion, a silent acknowledgement that something was off. Patients whispered of seeing someone move where no one should be, a shadow passing between ruins that was not a guard, not a civilian, not any of them. A stretcher that had held a young soldier moments before now sat empty, the bandages neatly folded, as if someone had prepared for its removal in advance. Instructions from the command seemed to contradict themselves with almost deliberate intent. One officer insisted that the doctors evacuate to a cleared side street immediately. Another arrived moments later to demand that surgeries continue on the burned thoroughfare without delay. The POWs moved between directives like ghosts navigating shifting walls, unsure which rules would save lives and which might condemn them. Amid this confusion, one small but impossible detail emerged. A set of surgical tools, freshly cleaned and polished, sat ready on a blood-stained table. Yet no one had used them, and no one admitted to touching them. The impossibility hung in the air, thick as the smoke curling from the distant ruins. The wounded themselves seemed to participate in the disruption. A man who had been moaning quietly was suddenly gone, leaving only the faint imprint of a blanket in the snow. Another patient, long since stabilized, began murmuring phrases that made no sense, names of streets that had long been destroyed, faces that no one had ever seen. Even the most stoic POWs felt the weight of unease pressing down on them, a silent chorus of questions with no answers. It was as if the city itself had paused, waiting for some hidden event to unfold. Every step along the ruined cobblestones now carried new tension. Shadows moved where no light fell, and the wind carried whispers of voices that could not exist. A civilian who had dared to ask why some patients had vanished was met with stares so sharp that he never spoke again. A distant explosion, faint but unmistakable, reminded everyone that the fire outside still burned unchecked. And within the heart of this chaos, the invisible pattern grew. Something or someone was orchestrating events behind the veil of smoke and ruin. Even the micro details were unsettling. A glove lay abandoned on the cobblestones, perfectly preserved in the cold, as though its owner had simply vanished mid-step. A crumpled piece of paper revealed a hastily drawn arrow pointing to a side street that no one had used in years. Footsteps echoed where no one walked. And through it all, the doctors, bound by duty, continued their work in uneasy silence, aware that this night had shifted into something unrecognizable, something they might never fully comprehend. The rhythm of survival had broken, leaving only a tense awareness that the hidden truth was closing in, quiet, deliberate, unstoppable. Someone had been here before dawn, but who? By the early morning, a faint grey light had begun to touch the ruins, but the shadows of the previous night still clung stubbornly to corners, alleys, and collapsed arches. Among the debris, a POW doctor noticed something unusual: a smudged, soot-stained piece of paper partially buried beneath a fallen beam. The note was brief, almost cryptic. "Do not speak. Procedure initiated." Fingers trembling, he lifted it, revealing crude diagrams, streets marked with excess, arrows pointing from one building to another, and strange annotations he couldn't fully decipher. His mind raced. Who had drawn this, and why? The diagrams suggested careful planning, but of what? As he examined the page, the distant echo of footsteps, or was it merely the wind, sent a chill down his spine. The city had been reduced to rubble. Yet it was alive with subtle movements he could not explain. Another POW joined him, nodding toward a faint trail in the snow, leading from one empty stretch of street to another. There were no footprints visible, yet something had passed through recently. One soldier, severely wounded but coherent, whispered names of streets that no longer existed, faces he claimed he saw in the shadows, and strange noises he swore were voices, but no one else heard them. The POWs exchanged uneasy glances. This was no accident. The events of the night had been orchestrated. A memory surfaced in one doctor's mind, buried beneath layers of fear and exhaustion. Months earlier, in another bomb town, he had seen the same pattern: patients disappearing, tools inexplicably appearing, streets suddenly cleared of bodies only to reveal others later. It had seemed like coincidence then. Now it was unmistakable. The hidden event was repeating, a carefully concealed ritual imposed upon the streets at night, leaving only fragments for anyone to reconstruct. The thought pressed upon him with suffocating weight: this was not a one-time disaster. This had happened before, and would happen again. In the center of the ruin, a faint metallic glint caught his eye. He crouched to find a surgical instrument, slightly out of place, resting atop a collapsed wooden beam. The tool was polished, clean, and ready to use, but no one had used it. Who had been here before him, and what had they done? He lifted his gaze toward the blackened cityscape. Flames still flickered in distant blocks, smoke curling like ghostly fingers. A body, or what seemed to be a body, moved silently through the ruins, yet when he blinked, it vanished. The uncertainty clawed at him. Was this the ghost of someone lost, or a living presence manipulating the scene? Every detail compounded the tension. A faint smell of antiseptic lingered, incongruous with the smoke and burned wood. A crumpled notebook lay nearby, pages torn or blackened, each containing fragments of instructions or names partially erased. One annotation repeated itself in several places: "Ensure procedure completed." The handwriting was unfamiliar, yet precise, almost clinical, suggesting someone had controlled events carefully, deliberately, and without error. The more he observed, the more he realized that the hidden event had layers he could not begin to understand. Even the wounded patients, still moaning and clutching bandages, seemed aware of it in subtle ways. One young man who had been quiet for hours suddenly screamed, pointing at a street that had been empty minutes earlier. The doctors rushed to check, only to find an empty stretch, nothing there, yet the sense of presence lingered like a phantom. No explanation satisfied the mind. Each observation hinted at a methodical pattern, carefully orchestrated behind the scenes, leaving a trace for those perceptive enough to notice, but impossible to fully comprehend. By the time the first true light of dawn touched the city, the POW doctors understood a terrifying truth. The events of the night were not accidental, not random, and not chaotic. They were orchestrated, hidden within the rubble, shadows, and smoke of a city in flames. And while fragments of the story could be pieced together, the diagrams, the erased instructions, the vanishing patients, the full horror remained deliberately obscured, leaving only unease, suspicion, and the gnawing certainty that someone had controlled the night from start to finish. No one would ever fully explain it, and that realization weighed more heavily than any physical wound the POWs had treated. Someone had planned this before the city burned. Weeks had passed since the night of fire, and the city's ruins were slowly being cleared. Yet the events of that night had not faded from memory. Instead, they had been swallowed by a deeper, more deliberate silence. The POW doctors returned to their quarters, but something in the air had shifted. Where there had once been chaotic coordination, now there was an almost unnatural order. Every report, every schedule, every entry seemed polished, erased, or replaced. Files that had recorded the movements of the POWs vanished, leaving only blank pages or cryptic notations. One missing chart in particular stood out, a meticulous list of doctors and patients that simply no longer existed. Those who had seen it whispered only in corners, their voices hushed, their eyes flicking to shadows as though someone could overhear them even now. Protocols were rewritten with mechanical precision. Procedures that had been informal or improvised during the chaos of the fire were now formalized, sterilized, and scrubbed of any hint of irregularity. One instruction manual was altered almost imperceptibly. The words "record all casualties" were replaced with "report only essentials," a subtle change that ensured entire segments of the night would be erased from memory. Even the officers overseeing the reconstruction moved with caution. Their conversations, though outwardly professional, carried the weight of unspoken knowledge, as if every word had to be chosen to avoid revealing what had really happened. Micro-details began to accumulate like fragments of a puzzle too disturbing to complete. A glove, still dusted with ash, was found wedged between pages of a ledger. A faint, unrecognizable footprint appeared in the snow outside the cleared hospital street. Documents that had been signed disappeared, and replacements were backdated with uncanny precision. Staff began to adopt subtle habits. A glance over the shoulder before speaking, the avoidance of certain topics, the quiet acknowledgement that some events were better left unexamined. Even the wounded, now recovered, seemed to carry an invisible imprint of the night's orchestration in their behavior, a flinch at fire, a hesitation near shadows, a silence when the topic of the city's ruins came up. Each microhook of tension built upon the last. No one mentioned the street again. A shadow lingered in every report. The fire consumed more than buildings, it consumed memory. Every moment, the psychological grip of the erased events tightened. The city was being rebuilt above, but below the surface, every record, every testimony, every trace of human error or intervention was being systematically removed or controlled. Those who had witnessed the hidden events now found themselves navigating a labyrinth of selective memory, institutional control, and deliberate omission. Even the POW doctors, once guided solely by duty and skill, began to internalize this enforced erasure. They moved through corridors and streets with a careful rhythm, hesitant to speak or act. The missing files, altered protocols, and meticulous cover-ups were more than administrative details. They were instruments of psychological control. Each silent acknowledgement, each carefully avoided conversation, reinforced the reality that no one outside a select few would ever know the true scale of what had occurred. The city was alive again, but the memory of that night was imprisoned, locked away behind layers of bureaucracy, fear, and deliberate suppression. By the end of this step, an unnerving clarity emerges. Survival is not only about life and death in the moment, but about the control of memory afterward. What happened on that night, who disappeared, who acted, and who failed to act, it had all been buried beneath the clean veneer of restored streets and rewritten documents. The POWs carried the knowledge silently, the civilians unconsciously obeyed its shadow, and the city itself seemed complicit in maintaining the erasure. And yet, even in silence, the lingering tension of suspicion, the discomfort of unspoken truths, and the echo of vanished lives persisted, preparing the audience for the quiet but morally charged reveal in the next step. No one would ever find the missing chart, or understand its contents. The sun rose slowly over the city, casting golden light on streets that had once been blackened by fire. Buildings had been rebuilt, markets reopened, and life resumed its rhythms as though the horrors of the night had been nothing more than a distant dream. Yet beneath the calm, a quiet tension lingered. The streets remembered in ways no record could capture. POW doctors walked among civilians, guards passed on routine patrols, and the city seemed outwardly ordinary, but the memory of that night had etched itself into every movement, glance, and pause. Shadows were avoided instinctively, empty corners caused an inexplicable unease, and even laughter felt slightly off-kilter, as if measured against a backdrop of vanished lives. Survivors carried the weight differently. Some developed rituals, checking hallways twice, refusing to speak of certain streets, or lingering over moments when someone had vanished in front of them. Even the simplest human behaviors, glances, hesitations, words left unspoken, were now infused with the memory of that night. It was a psychological imprint, a ghost of what had occurred, and a reminder that survival often demanded compromises no one could fully justify. The moral tension was unavoidable. Those who acted did so under extreme conditions, and yet the consequences had rippled far beyond the individuals present, leaving a permanent scar on human conscience. The full truth remained deliberately obscured. Records had been rewritten, witnesses silenced, and streets restored to pristine normality. The city, now reborn, seemed to deny the very events that had shaped it, and yet in quiet moments the memory persisted. POW doctors, once forced to operate amidst chaos, remembered each vanishing patient, every shadow that moved unseen, and every inexplicable set of instructions. Civilians carried subtle signs of trauma, their behaviors shaped unconsciously by the unseen orchestration of that night. Even the guards, who had observed silently, were haunted by a memory they could not articulate. The moral discomfort intensified because it offered no resolution. Could anyone have acted differently? Was there truly a right choice in circumstances so extreme? And if survival required the erasure of memory and the manipulation of truth, what price did humanity pay? The answer was as elusive as the vanished patience, imperfect, incomplete, and profoundly unsettling. The audience, now aware of the careful orchestration, the erased evidence, and the human cost, is left to grapple with the tension between duty, survival, and morality. Finally, the camera pans over the rebuilt city streets at dawn, calm, almost serene, yet shadowed by the past. A single folded bandage rests on a windowsill, a silent testament to the lives saved and lost, to decisions made under duress, and to the invisible line between action and conscience. The story ends not with information, but with reflection. It asks the viewer to consider, what would you do if you were forced to choose between life and ethics, duty and survival? And what would remain of your conscience long after the flames had gone out? Silence falls. Only the faint echo of the fire remains, lingering in memory, impossible to fully erase. Even the rebuilt city could not erase what had happened,